From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Dan O'Brien standing by to offer his weekly grain market analysis. He'll comment on the market impact of China's decision to place those hefty duties on U.S. grain sorghum exports. And Dan will also share his latest price probability projections for corn. Following then, K-State's Jeff Whitworth on alfalfa weevil control, given the recent cold weather, how that's influenced weevil feeding on alfalfa stands and what that means in terms of the need for treatment. He'll also comment on controlling aphid activity in alfalfa. And later on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp will be along. Plus more, straight ahead on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to Agriculture Today on the K-State Radio Network. Welcome once again. Well, the grain markets are not lacking for dynamic developments, that's to be certain, and we'll take up the latest now in our weekly grain market segment featuring K-State Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien from his office in Colby. Let's address this first, Dan, the latest trade bombshell, if you will, to hit the grain markets, and that would be China actually moving forward and imposing that, what they're calling anti-dumping duty on U.S. imported grain sorghum. And in that, China is far and away the largest customer of U.S. grain sorghum exports. Why, this is a major blow.
Without question, which of course causes lots of concern on the part of grain sorghum producers here in the U.S. As they look to answer the question of where their old crop supplies are going and what their prospects are for new crop at the same time. And trying to quantify the impact of it, the USDA in its April 10th projection of supply-demand for grain sorghum had projected that the U.S. in this marketing year, again ending August 31st, would be shipping about 245 million bushels of U.S. grain sorghum overseas. When you look at the actual record of how much has moved so far, with the vast majority of it going to China, you're looking at about 175 to 176 million bushels. So what's at risk? That 65, 70 million bushel difference. And if you dig further into the USDA numbers, the pre-purchases of U.S. grain sorghum export sales were 95, 98%, all going to China. So it sure causes a lot of consternation on the part of shippers. There are some other ramifications. Again, with China making this move, they have affected the profit and loss margins of their own domestic feed users. Whereas there had been a solid demand for U.S. grain sorghum in that country, well, now, by fiat dictate of their own government, the cost of U.S. supply is going to jump up quite a bit. They can look to some other countries, a very limited number, to supply grain sorghum. If you look at, in this marketing year, who's projected to have grain sorghum export sales, it's Argentina, Australia, to some degree, Nigeria. Probably where China will look would be into the barley market. A lot higher volume of barley sales, and if they move in that direction, then you open up a whole number of other suppliers, in particular Russia and Ukraine, with barley supplies to sell, the European Union, some other players as well, and of course Argentina and Australia is still in play. So it just seems that as these negotiations go on and these countries, and I hope I'm not being just facetious, but as they keep throwing haymakers at each other, right, are they getting to the place to where they put enough pressure upon the other countries and cause enough consternation from their own internal constituencies that they end up and drive themselves to come up with some type of solution to these trade issues.
Well, looking beyond the trade turmoil and getting into what's going on the ground, planting delays for corn, as we stay with feed grains for the time being, and those are becoming more supportive to the market, Dan.
Well, yes, and when you look at a weather map, or I guess more readily a soil moisture map of the United States, you can draw a line from the northeast to the southwest corner of Illinois, and to the east of that line, they have some pretty wet soils. To the west of that line, you've got kind of a neutral area, and then it doesn't take long for you to get into some pretty dry areas. With that, you add in information provided by the USDA in terms of soil temperatures for planting, with the idea that we have to get about 50 degrees to plant corn, and you're seeing some pretty wet areas that all during the week of April 8th through the 14th were averaging about 41 to 47 degrees soil temperature, and that's running right through, again, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and everything north of that being colder, and actually even over into most of Iowa and a good part of Nebraska still in the 40s. Here in Kansas, the numbers during that time frame were, well, you see a range, of course. The coldest temperatures to the north, as you'd expect, 40, 46 degrees, well, 46, 45 degrees, something like that. To the south, 51, 56. The USDA corn planting showing that we've just barely started in Kansas. That's about 8% planted as of April the 15th, normally at about 15%. So, Eric, yes, we're concerned about this, but really until we start to see delays, actual delays in the three I states, Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa, then I'm not sure how much the market will really strongly respond to that. The ramifications are that, gosh, if we're delayed in planting and push out the backside of the planting window, the optimal planting window, 1 or 2 million acres of corn, well, that would take us down to, instead of the 88 million acre number that was in the prospective plantings report, it takes us to 80, 85, 86, and if we get 170 bushels per acre for each million acres, down you're 170 million in production. So 2 million acres, 370. You're pushing and pushing and pushing. You're tamping down the prospects for the size of the U.S. corn crop this year, and ending up and probably giving us better price prospects, at least moderately better price prospects for corn. And at the same time, if we're not going to plant in those major states those acres to corn, where are they going? Well, assuming that eventually things do drive up, those acres would go into soybeans, and that would raise concerns for increased oversupply for beans later on in the summer. Actually probably heightens the risk of some really low prices for soybeans in the fall of 2018.
Now, it's worth noting that you have put together your latest price probability projection for corn, and in fact, you have factored in the possibility of these planting delays resulting in lower corn acres, which consequently, of course, would affect price.
Lower corn acres, and or even more so, trying to gauge what the probability is for any type of a short crop situation. And right now, as long as the Eastern Corn Belt doesn't show, Central, Eastern, Northern Corn Belt doesn't show major drought issues yet, you're probably hesitant to back off of yield very much. But if you're looking at basically the 88 million acres planted, 80.8 harvested, 176 bushels, you're already down to about around 14 billion bushels of grain harvested. Then, again, as we said, if you start shaving 1-2 million acres off of that, you're down below 14 billion bushels, down to 13.8, 13.6, with pretty strong uses. We've got it for most of those usage categories. You're getting down closer to 10, 11% stocks to use, and probably 50, 75 cent per bushel higher prices than what the USDA had projected earlier, which is about 340, 350.
And while we're talking about price probability projections, you have conducted the same exercise, to put it that way, for wheat. What is that telling us?
Well, Eric, there's sure the question, do you dare get excited about wheat with so many problems
right.
in the world situation? In terms of the world market, the world is awash with wheat. But we're having major questions about how much production we'll have in our three main hard red winter wheat producing states, Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, really raising some questions about what our yield and or harvested acreage numbers will be. So with that, the USDA has projected about 465, 470. It's not difficult at all to see our own domestic production problems. We could see something 50 cents to 60 or more cents higher than that. But it seems to be capped in terms of how high it could go just because of the troubles that we're seeing right now in terms of moving wheat off of our shores through exports. That's the hard reality we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. And just a quick nod to the soybean market. And again, on exports, we're seeing lackluster business currently, which pressures this market.
We had the slowest export week we've had for quite a while in this for the week ending April the 12th, down to just under 15 million bushels, and we need a pace of about 25 million bushels to meet the USDA's export projection. And, of course, all this is kind of getting roiled up and entangled in the switching of Chinese buyers to Brazil right now. Where we are seeing strength is in soybean meal exports, bullish. So with that, what we're losing in terms of raw soybean exports, we seem to be gaining in terms of soybean meal exports, tied in with the Argentina situation down to the south, and maybe our orientation needs to switch in terms of seeing where the opportunities are. Now they're apparently more so often soybean meal exports as opposed to soybeans. And again, how do potential sanctions from China on soybean exports affect what we could see happening in terms of soybean meal? That might be the direction we're going.
Well, all of this and much more is fully covered in Dan's weekly notes on the grain markets, and those have been posted now. They're up for your review. Producers at agmanager.info. Dan, good summary as always. We'll catch up with you again next Friday.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
He's a grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Dan O'Brien with us on this opening segment of Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Agriculture Today returns now. It's our regular alfalfa insect watch once again as we get into the early stages of the alfalfa production season now. Jeff Whitworth has been out and about, taking a look at fields and hearing from producers as well about, among other things, alfalfa weevil activity. Jeff, as you know, is a crop entomologist with K-State Research and Extension. And one of the things that growers have been wondering about, you say, Jeff, the cold weather we've had so far this spring. Has that done anything to slow down what we see typically as alfalfa weevil feeding?
We have been out probably for the last 3 weeks, at least once a week, going out because as the weather fluctuates from cold, as you said, real cold, the sub-freezing temperatures, and then it warms back up. Everybody wants to know what's happening, with especially alfalfa weevils, because that's the insect of concern right now. Mm-hmm. And the alfalfa is growing, not very fast, not very quickly, or not very well in many cases, but it is still producing alfalfa weevils, or the alfalfa weevil is still utilizing the alfalfa for a host. I get questions all the time, what is cold for insects to really affect an agricultural insect pest? Really and truly, they're really well adapted to cold weather. They're pretty well adapted to warm weather, but if it gets down into the lower or the mid-20s and stays there for a few hours, that's going to affect insect populations. We've seen it over the last 10 or 12 years, but not all of them. It's not going to kill them all. You got to remember, insects are well adapted to Kansas weather. They've been here a lot longer than we have, so they've adapted to the vagaries of the weather, the warm, cold, dry, wet, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, we've been out looking. You can find alfalfa weevils. This is mid to late April, probably the latest that we haven't yet sprayed or treated for alfalfa weevils at least one time, but it's just weather related. The weather allows insect development or controls insect development. So as we've been out looking, we've found dead weevils, dead larvae. And when I talk about weevils, we have not found an adult yet, but they overwinter as adults or eggs, so there could be some around. And I'll tell you why that's important in a little bit. But right now we've been looking for the larval stage, the larvae, because that's the feeding stage. That's what's causing the damage. And as we go out and look, we're looking and we're finding just little pinprick-sized holes in the leaves and a little bit of where the terminals have been eaten around. And if you open up those terminals, everything we've seen in the terminals are the first instar larvae, just real small lime green larvae. Actually, they're pretty tough to see. They're really small. They're just hatching out. And some of them will hold brown or black larvae, and those are larvae that have been exposed or somehow have succumbed to the cold weather. So you'll find in the same terminal, oftentimes, you'll find a live larva and a dead larva. The live larva is still feeding, or at least it's not dead yet, it's still able to feed. So I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means the eggs hatched the next day, and so the larva lived through the cold weather as an egg, or the larvae hatched the day before and it was killed in the cold. But anyway, my point is
around.
There's still a lot of larvae around, okay? And because there's adults, there's probably still more eggs to come. The adults will probably be in the leaf litter below, around the ground and the base of the canopy, so the cold weather is not going to affect them. They're very mobile. I don't know how they do it, but they perceive cold weather coming, they get down where it's protected. Also, as we were looking for adults, and we've been looking for larvae, as you scratch the leaf litter around the base of the plant or around below the canopy, you'll find larvae. And most of the time we find larger larvae, the second instar larvae. So apparently, as they perceived the cold weather coming earlier on, they crawled down the plant, and you'll find they'll curl up into a little C-shaped, and they've been able to get through the cold weather. Now, what's going to happen, what we've seen in past years, as the weather warms up, these larvae will crawl back up the plant. Okay? As they crawl back up the plant, they don't care what they feed on. As soon as they come in contact with that first green leaf, they will start feeding. Well, what that means is then if you do reach a treatment threshold, eventually, and the weather does warm up and the wind quits blowing so that you do decide to treat, and you can, those larvae will be probably pretty well protected in the canopy down around the base of the plant, feeding on those lower leaves, whereas the later ones that hatch out will be up, and so if you spray it with an insecticide, it should get good control. But the ones down around the bottom of the plant or in the canopy, you're going to have to use more gallonage to get that insecticide to where they are, because remember, the alfalfa weevil insecticides, all the insecticides that are labeled or registered for alfalfa weevils are contact insecticides. That's a question I get a lot. Are they systemic? Does the plant take them up and translocate it? They don't. It's contact insecticide, so you have to use enough gallonage to get the insecticide to where the weevil's going to come in contact with it. Now, the larger ones are down there feeding. The ones I saw, second instar, under normal temperatures, and by that, maybe I shouldn't say normal, maybe I should say average temperatures.
Whatever normal is.
Yeah, in Kansas, who knows, right? If you have 65 to 75 degree average temperatures, they'll probably finish feeding in about 7 to 10 days. So if you're out and about looking around, and most of your population are made up of the larger weevils, you got at least another 7 to 10 days. However, I really think because of the cold weather, we've slowed down the adults from laying eggs, and I think they're going to continue to lay eggs, and once it warms up, inserting the eggs into the stems. And so I think probably we're going to see the little first instar, the very small larvae that are there, from the temperatures I see in the next 10 to 14-day forecast, I don't see any really cold temperatures. Mm-hmm. So they're probably going to do well. They're probably going to be feeding. They're probably going to be doing some damage in the terminals in the top of the plant. The adults are going to be inserting eggs in the stem. Probably 5 or 6 days later, those eggs are going to hatch out, and those larvae are going to start feeding also. But it's all predicated on the weather. So if the temperatures are in the 40s, 50s at night, 70s and 80s during the daytime, that's perfect alfalfa weevil weather. They're a cool weather insect. They're going to do well. So the larger larvae are going to be feeding, and the smaller larvae are going to be feeding, and the eggs are going to be hatching over probably about another 3 to 4 week period of time. The fields that we've looked at in the last week, they range anywhere from 0% infested, which I've not seen probably in 15 years, mid-April, 0, no live alfalfa weevil larvae, to 10%.
And the threshold for treatment is much higher than
that. The threshold
right?
that we use is 33 to 50%. So if you have 1 per 3 or 1 per 2 stems infested, that's when we say you should treat. So 10%, not close yet. But we did find one small field that had a 35% infestation. So that just tells me that you need to get out and look. Every field's different. You need to get out and sample or monitor those fields. So that's where we just pull stems, shake them in a bucket, and determine, how many stems you've pulled. I do 10 in 4 or 5 different places in a field, and then count the number of larvae from 40 or 50 stems. That's really easy. Really gives you a good idea of the infestation level. One of the problems right now, these really small ones are hard to shake out into a bucket. They're right up there in those terminals. So when you're shaking that stem in that bucket, it's not going to dislodge them. But wait 3 or 4 days or 5 days. Once they get a little bit larger, they're a little easier to dislodge. You might get a little more accurate count of the infestation level. But you need to look at each field separately. You need to do 4 or 5 locations in those fields. And I always recommend every 5 days or 7 days get out and look, because these infestation levels can change pretty quickly based upon the temperature. At the same time we've been out, we've been finding pea aphids.
And those are the other primary pests early on in alfalfa.
Pea aphids are one of the other, pests that we look for or we caution against in alfalfa. Now, we have found pea aphids at every alfalfa field we've looked at, and the weather does not seem to have harmed them at all. We've not found any dead ones, and we have looked. But one of the positives is we've also, in all those fields, we found aphid predators and or parasites. In some fields we found lady beetles. They're great at eating aphids. We found some mummies, some parasitized aphids, so that means the little wasps are at work. And most recently, we found some green lacewings. So one of the things you need to consider, if you do spray for alfalfa weevil larvae, you're going to kill all the pea aphids, but you're also going to kill all the beneficials that are out there. And the few pea aphids that we found so far, they're not even close to a treatment threshold. But they can act as a springboard for later in the summer for beneficials to help their populations to expand for later on. If we get any soybean aphids or sugarcane aphids or any other aphids, that's always a good source of predators and parasites is alfalfa for later on. But, if you have to spray alfalfa weevil larvae, you have to spray them because they are devastating. I mean, they can, in 3 days, we have some really good photographs of how they just completely defoliate alfalfa. So, but it's just a consideration if you're on the borderline. That's something to consider, is how it's going to impact the beneficials.
All right. We'll have you back again soon. Jeff, thanks for coming over.
My pleasure. Thank you, Eric.
That from Research and Extension crop entomologist here at K-State, Jeff Whitworth, and that's the word from Jeff's field inspections and from comments he's hearing from producers as well about the insect activity in alfalfa around Kansas. This is Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggle to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, the latest from the Weather Data Library here at K-State on Kansas agricultural weather. Aboard once again, as always on a Friday, is Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp. And Mary, there may well be moisture relief coming for many parts of Kansas, but this follows another dry week with extreme temperature swings and dust blowing, just about every pestilence you could think of.
Well, we haven't had any tornadoes. And that's,
or locusts, for that matter.
Yeah, or locusts, for that matter. But the tornadoes has kind of made the news that Kansas and Oklahoma have had a very late start to the tornado season, and we'll take that as at least some light behind the gray clouds that are not producing anything in the way of moisture. Statewide average for the week was just 0.06 of an inch, which was less than 10% of normal, actually 9% of normal. We did a analysis of just how dry we are, and we're running between the driest start to the year in some of the western divisions to the sixth driest in our wet spot, which is southeast Kansas. And they're only something like 40% of normal for the year to date, less than that. So again, a very, very dry pattern.
And that goes back how many years then?
1895, which is why it's not surprising that we have such a large area of exceptional drought, which is the most extreme category for the drought. We ended up being cooler than normal for the week, and that's despite flirting with the 100-degree range out in western Kansas. Western Kansas, southwestern Kansas both had locations that recorded 99 for the high, and that was on the 13th of April. But they dropped down to 14 and 17. So, again, that shows the kind of swings that you get. And, of course, when you have those really big temperature swings, you usually have some pretty strong winds to go with it, and we had dust storms across much of the western part of the state. There was a major dust storm in northwest Kansas that resulted in a multi-car pileup. Even in areas where they've had residue on top of the soil to try and keep it down, the winds were strong enough. We were seeing corn stalks flying in the breeze, which was basically stripping that residue off the fields. So those are creating quite a few problems.
Not to mention the wildfires again that struck multiple counties in the west.
Right, and it wasn't just in the west. There were wildfires across the state. The one that got a lot of the press was the one out in western Kansas. This time the fire came over the line from Colorado, and that particular fire is listed as having around 45 square miles burnt in eastern Colorado and western Kansas. So a significant fire. And again, it's not the only one that's out there. It's the one that's just gotten the most attention.
Before we talk about the prospects for moisture coming up, later today and into the weekend, the soil temperature readings, of course, our corn producers are monitoring that. Are they picking up a bit?
They are picking up a bit, and it is interesting to note that even with that temperature dropping into the teens, with that very cold spell that we had, soil temperatures stayed above freezing for the most part, and they have rebounded fairly nicely with mostly it's the sunshine adding to those near normal temperatures that we ended the week with that have brought that up. And if producers are interested in tracking those soil temperatures, they can go to Mesonet, that's mesonet.ksu.edu, and click on the soil temperature link. There's a map there that shows what the current conditions are. You can switch it and look at the 2-inch or the 4-inch if you're planting a little bit deeper to get into that moisture. You can check and see how that's tracking, and you can also chart the patterns of those soil temperatures for the different stations, because it might be reading 55 now, but if it's been bouncing up and down like the air temperatures have, you may want to wait a little bit longer and let that stabilize a little bit. The outlooks for the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day pattern temperatures are looking a little bit more promising. They are looking to be seasonal, so we're looking for highs in the 60s and 70s. But even more important, our lows are supposed to stay above freezing, and that will be very welcome. It's been a very late start to the spring, and we're ready for that to come. We'd like to have a spring rather than jump from winter to the summer.
It'd be great to see temperatures back on an even keel, respectively, once again. And to the moisture prospects, again, we are expecting this system to roll out of the Four Corners area into Kansas over the weekend. And depending on where you are, this could be a substantial relief or just a modest break in the dryness.
Well, it's been really interesting that we've been watching this all week long, and it started out looking much more promising with it tracking further north and bringing as much as 2 to 3 inches of rain across most of Kansas. They've backed off on that quite a bit, and it looks like more of that moisture is going to our south through Oklahoma. The latest quantitative precip forecast that came out this morning is calling for somewhere around an inch along the western third of the state, and that would be the most substantial moisture that they've seen in quite some time.
Extremely welcome.
Unfortunately, that drops off as it moves east, and when we get to northeastern Kansas, we may be down to 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch, which isn't going to go very far, given the fact that we're supposed to see about 1/10 of an inch a day, so it won't even make it to our normal for the week. The other unfortunate thing is that this looks like our best shot for maybe the next week to 10 days. So if we don't get as much out of the system as we hoped, there's not really anything on the horizon that looks like it will be as productive if it produces anything at all. So we really need for this to actually verify and get the moisture that's currently in the forecast.
And if it exceeds the forecast, so much the better.
Right. We would hopefully get it spread out at least over the 24 hours, if not the 48 hours, because we're not going to get much relief if that inch falls in a brief thunderstorm and most of that would run off rather than actually penetrating the soils and doing something to get the green up started.
Mary, as always, thanks for passing this along.
Thanks, Eric.
That from Research and Extension Climatologist here at K-State, Mary Knapp. Again, as she referred to earlier, be sure to tap into all of that good information on the Weather Data Library's website, mesonet.ksu.edu, mesonet.ksu.edu. Meantime, a good weekend to you. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.